Hi, my name is Jacqueline Donachie and I'm an artist and I'm presenting this lecture in absence for Leamington Spa. So the title of the lecture is Inherited Characteristics, Artworks Made in Response to the Genetics that Both Connect and Separate Siblings. So I'm just going to start, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see the talk. Here we go. And view slideshow. Okay, so yes, here we go. So yeah, the artworks are all made. The talk is around artworks that are held in the collection at Leamington Spa that were purchased in 2013 by the Contemporary Art Society, which is a body of work that I'm going to talk about, but I'll also talk about some of the other works around about that, both before and after, that are connected by, perhaps the most simple thing is to say that they're connected by my relationship with my sister, who has muscular dystrophy. She has a form of muscular dystrophy called myotonic dystrophy. And this was discovered in our family a long time ago now. It was so long ago that you can see me quite massively pregnant in that photograph. So it was diagnosed in our family in 1999. And I remember the date very well because I was also pregnant with my son when my sister had her second child, the little girl down here, my niece Rona, who was very sick when she was born in an incubator. And I was at that point pregnant with my son. So it was all quite a dramatic time, but really initially, like all families that are diagnosed with these types of inherited genetic conditions, if there's a sick baby in the mix, you tend to focus on the baby, and all our attention went on that. But over the course of a few months, well, initially I was the first one that had to go and be tested once we diagnosed it on Susan's side of the family. So in the course of a few months, my brother was also diagnosed, and my sister's other son, who was 3 or 4 at the time. So as is common with most families, what happens is you have to have a lot of conversations over dinner tables. People are advised to go and get tested. And very quickly, you have not one person who's diagnosed with it, but 6 or 7, which is exactly what happened in my family. So following the shock of that, I have always been quite keen to use art as a way to find out about other things that are going on in my life. And so there was an opportunity to apply for these SciArt Awards, which were being funded by the Wellcome Trust. And we were quite keen to, my sister suggested that perhaps we could use it to find out some more about this condition. And it's from that I met this, he looks very young in that photograph, Professor Darren Monkton. He wasn't a professor at that point, it's the guy in the middle of the photograph. And they agreed to apply for some funding with me, and we used that funding for a kind of blue skies research trip to the Saguenay region of Canada, which was as much getting to know about what they did and them getting to know what I did as a contemporary artist as anything else. And we used the time to visit some people that were connected to the muscular dystrophy campaign in Quebec. And the reason we went to this part of Quebec was that they had a 10 times higher national incidence of this particular condition, myotonic dystrophy, than in other parts of Canada and also other parts of the world. And this is because of a thing called a founder effect, which you get a lot with genetics, where with populations who are remote and don't travel, you have a much higher incidence because families not just intermarry, but they have big families and people tend not to travel, or did tend not to travel, so the incidences can increase. So we used that money to make a very blue skies research trip, and I was very much finding out about the condition, and I recorded all the people that I met. I took photographs of them, like this photograph here. And then from there, we went on to explore a bigger project, which was called Tomorrow Belongs to Me. So this doesn't have my sister and I in it, but it was a process of interviewing a lot of scientists and finding out about their roles in the discovery of this genetic peculiarity of myotonic dystrophy, which is a thing called anticipation, which you get with myotonic dystrophy, but you also get it with a few other conditions like Fragile X and Huntington's disease, which is probably a more known condition, but it does affect the same number of people as myotonic dystrophy. But anticipation is where a condition gets worse as it's passed on through families. So each generation, the children have a severer form of the condition. So what happened was that families very much knew this was happening, because they could see, as in my family, you could see that the condition that my niece had was so much worse than the condition that my father had, which is where we had traced it back to. So he never had any symptoms of myotonic dystrophy until in his 60s. My sister didn't have any symptoms that she really knew about until she was in her 30s, but she had had a child who was very sick from birth. So that is how anticipation manifests itself with myotonic dystrophy. It's a bit different with Huntington's. That is where there's a higher prevalence. So you'll have more children who are affected by it. I don't give this side of the talk very well. You'll have to get Darren Monkton to talk to you about the genetics of it. But what I was interested in was where one particular woman that we interviewed, this lady, Stephanie Sherman, talked a lot about why it took so long to prove this phenomenon. And the reason it took so long was because they didn't listen to families. Scientists had an idea of how they thought this should work, because they didn't want to be associated with the eugenics movement, which was one of the big instigators around genetic research in the 30s. And this had grown into, scientists had spent a long time trying to disprove the eugenics arguments that there was rotten branches on the trees of life. But there was a level of truth. There was a clear truth in the fact that this gene was getting worse as it was passed on. The symptoms it was causing were getting worse as it was passed on. So Stephanie Sherman talked a lot in her interview about how they didn't listen to the families when they were doing the research, until eventually they had so much scientific data that they had to go back to the families and say, okay, I'm sorry, can you now tell us about your father's side of the family? This was in relation to Fragile X syndrome. So from that project, I did an exhibition with Darren Monkton in the Hunterian Museum at Glasgow University. And this was in 2006. And you can see the film was kind of very central to the exhibition. And we edited the film. This was made very collaboratively with Darren. We edited the film to have a talking head scenario, and each person talks about their aspect of the discovery. Some are scientists, some are clinicians. So some people talk about seeing patients, other people talk about gathering sperm samples, which is what Nancy Wexler did incredibly when she went to Venezuela to get more data. And her mother had died of Huntington's disease, and she was very driven to find out more about the condition. So the benches in the front are an artwork by me called Tell Me About Your Father's Side, which were very much about creating opportunities where people could sit and talk to one another. So there's lots of little scenarios of where you might sit and have a conversation with someone. So from that in 2006, it was a huge amount of work, but it was quite data-led, quite sciencey in a way. So from that, I was working in my studio, and I was invited to do an exhibition in Gothenburg with there was 3 other artists, and it was about research-based practice. And at that point, I started to draw for the exhibition, partly in a lot of ways because I didn't have any money at that point, and my kids were very young. And I was really struggling to think of how I could make new work. I got very bogged down in the collaborative aspect of the Wellcome Trust project, and really was trying to kind of explore much more specifically my relationship to this condition as much as my relationship to my sister, I suppose. So I started to do these drawings in my studio where I had a whole lot of kind of kit that you might use if you had a disabled person in your household. Not all of it was needed at that point, like these chairs that you get to get people into the bath, and like armrests and walking sticks and various things. And also I had some pulleys and hoists where I sort of set up these scenarios and I drew them. So these drawings, which were originally, some of them were pen and ink, but there was a whole set that were done very simply with pencil on mapping paper. It was very thin paper, and I hadn't drawn in really a long time, years, like 10, 15 years since I'd kind of devoted any proper time to practicing drawing. So these are very important works for me, and I went on to make a whole series of them, which is in the collection at Leamington Spa. So they've all got these kind of pulley systems. There's a slide just coming up in a minute. I'll go to forward. So they're over here in the corner here. This is shown in Gothenburg, and you can see these with the collection at Leamington Spa as well. And some of those other pictures are of the pen and ink version of the same scenarios. So just to go back to another work in that show was a work called Winter Trees, which is these sculptures that I made that are quite a direct portrait reference to my sister. And in the background, you can just see these photographs, which are called Susan's Eyes, which showed her eyelids just after she had had some surgery, which you can get done to kind of pin up your eyelids. So she's sort of staring out into the exhibition. But you can see this is a good image that shows winter trees quite clearly. And yeah, it is effectively a portrait of me and my sister. My sister's neck now doesn't, well, now it's worse again, but in 2008, when I made this work, there was quite a tilt to her neck. Even then, which I found this scaffolding part, which articulated it well enough for my purposes at the time. And this leatherette is a kind of version of a skirt of hers that I used to steal when we went clubbing. We were both quite goth. So yeah, so it's a portrait. This is a portrait of two sisters. Quite a lot of this work that is in this whole series is in some way portraiture. So there's just different ways to do that. And this piece was then a subsequent piece that I went on to make. I made more of these winter trees sculptures and also did more quite detailed drawing. Oh, well, that's going on there. And I did these quite detailed drawings, which this was from the show that I did at Leamington Spa called Keep Up, which was new works and some other works from the collection. I don't know why it keeps doing that. It's now become timed. So yeah, so this drawing of the street light is the very first time I did this very detailed drawing. It's in a very, very long piece of paper. Sorry, it keeps doing that. And it's just pen on cartridge paper, but it's about, the whole roll of paper is about 10 foot long. So then from these sort of quite small scale drawing and sculpture works, I was very keen to make a second film. Having made the film Tomorrow Belongs to Me, which is very collaborative, I wanted to make a film just on my own this time, but rather than have scientists on the screen, I was very interested in making a film. I was quite keen to make a film where it had people who had the condition on a screen, particularly sisters, where one sister had the gene and one sister did not, mirroring the situation of me and my sister. So I did this as part of doctoral research with Northumbria University, which I found was a kind of respectful way to contact people, women, and ask them to talk about something quite personal. I found the kind of structure of doing that through a university. I was doing a PhD. It kind of added, I know how it is from my family, that just to kind of turn up with a camera and ask people to be quite open about their experience. So I had to do quite a lot of ethics work with the university, which was training in a way for so I found it a very useful process. So using this university situation of doing a PhD, I was able to work with the UK patient registry and register for myotonic dystrophy. And registries are kind of patient-led data depositories where patients who have myotonic dystrophy can have their details held so that it is available to researchers. And usually those researchers would be scientists or clinicians who have perhaps a drug trial that they want to test, or some kind of very specific treatment that they want to test. But I I contacted the registry, which I knew about, and asked if I could contact patients through them for a creative study. So that was to assist me in making the film that I wanted to make. And so what I had asked the registry to, what they do is they send letters out to everyone in their database or emails, and then the people have to contact me directly. So the registry is just a conduit to, it's all quite complicated. So anyway, through this process, I was able to send out a call for sisters to contact me, where sisters where one had the gene and one did not. And through that process, we had about 20 people got back in touch and to make the film. And then from that, I was able to identify 5 sister sets that were in the film. One was a set of 3 sisters. So where 2 sisters had the gene and Lorraine on the end here on the right did not have the gene. And in, oh, so I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, so Michelle, Stephanie and Lorraine were interviewed in Essex. I'm going to move myself and then you can see that. So they were interviewed all over. It's quite weird, my picture there with them. So they were all over the UK. I'm going to go back again. Don't know why that's stopped sharing. So this is some comments made by the genetics, one of the clinicians who's involved with the campaign. And when I interviewed the sisters, one of the things I asked them to talk about was their appearance. I asked them to describe their sister and I asked them to describe themselves. And in this discussion around appearance, it was quite important to me because all the women were aged between 18 and in their early 60s. So it was also, I think at that point, very much a portrait of aging, because, you know, there's a kind of process that all women go through when they age, where they become very aware of the changes that age is having on them. And also the women who have myotonic dystrophy have a very different thing to deal with, because it really does affect your facial muscles, it affects all of your muscles. So I was interested in asking the women about that. And then it turned out when I showed the film back to a lot of scientists who worked with the condition, they had never thought that women would be bothered about the fact that their faces changed because of a genetic condition. It's like, why would you not even think of that? So again, that takes me back to that idea of why we don't listen to people who have these conditions about what bothers them, because it's not always what bothers families that dictates research. And I say that, but having been involved in this community, like in my first involvement was 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, because my son is now 22. In that time, there has been a huge difference in how families are viewed within the research, but I think there is still work to do. So this was part of the feedback that we got from that initial film. And I'm going to just show you a little clip, myself up here, and hopefully this clip will work of the film Hazel.
I look nothing like my sister. If my sister walked in here now and sat down next to me, you would not even think that we were related. We are completely different. I'm slightly shorter than she is, a little bit heavier than she is, different colour hair. We're just so different. The only thing that is alike with us is the fact that we both have blue eyes.
With my physical appearance, I know that my face has dropped, especially my eyelids. They are a bit hooded, and also they can sort of like pull them and they look a bit strange. My mouth is sloping down, so a smile is just sort of straight. I know that I've got a lot of lines as well, but yeah, I know that, and then my hands, especially my fingers. I think sometimes a lot of people have the hands that look sort of a bit like spades, but I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying to sort of keep them, because a lot of people sort of just look like that, if that makes any sort of sense, and like that. But I'm trying not to do that. I remember my mum's hand looked a bit like sort of spades, and they were sort of like tilted slightly. But I know there's definitely my face that's actually dropped, but it doesn't look. I know that I can tell that my features have actually changed. It's sort of just going down.
So yeah, there was a lot of funders involved in that. So I think, how did I get on to the next slide? There we go. So yeah, and this was again some of the feedback that came from the curator of the registry, which talked about how they felt much more able to think of art as a way that you could be directly involved in scientific research and how to make it more accessible, but also to speak back to the medical and scientific research profession. I feel very strongly it's not just about communicating what scientists do, but also about influencing how scientists work. That is quite important to me, and it's something that I continue to do through this work that often involves my own family situation, but it's about presenting lived experience in different ways, which is what artists are very good at. So yeah, all of this work went into a publication. There's a publication for the Tomorrow Belongs to Me project, and then which has all the interviews with the scientists, which are available on my website. And then there's a second publication that was published by Glasgow Museums for the Hazel project, because it was part of a bigger exhibition, which I'll go on to show you some photographs of shortly. But this was just to mention the book, because it does contain all of the interviews with the sisters, which is quite an incredible thing to have got all these women in one. They didn't all meet, they were all interviewed individually, but to talk about their experience of the condition, but also to talk about their experience of having a sister who has the condition. And some of them were very moving. I very deliberately didn't put the really emotional parts into the film clips that we used in the film. What people talk about in the film is very mundane in a way. They talk about their appearance, they talk about one of the younger women wants to have a child and has gone through IVF. One of the older women talks about how her grandchildren think she was alive during the Civil War. So she talks very much, and she talks about all the siblings that she had who have died in the time that she has. Most of them died when they were quite young because they were affected by the condition. So there's a kind of, yeah, it's not, there's some very upsetting information in the interviews, because all of the women in the film found out as adults that they had the condition. None of them were born with it that they know of, and it usually came about through a time when they were trying to have a child or had a child and the child was very sick. So they're all held in this book, which is a great record of it. And as part of that same exhibition, I made another work, which is called Pose Work for Sisters, which is the second work that was made around about the same time in 2016. So this is very directly made with my sister. She doesn't really like it, but she agreed to help me make the work, which she's done before in the past. She's not an artist and she doesn't have any interest in art, but sometimes I can persuade her to do things on my behalf. So this film was based, as you can see from this still, on the very famous Bruce MacLean work from 1967 called Pose Work for Plinths. And he made this work in response to all the Henry Moore sculptures that were in the Tate collection. And he got given a bunch of plinths into his studio and took this series of photographs of him emulating the Henry Moore poses of women. So in another layer of cyclic working, me and my sister as women made this film where we then held these different poses. And I've got a little clip here. Again, it is about portraiture, but what I wanted to show and what I think comes across in the film was very much how much we have in common, as well as how much we have that is different. So the film runs in a loop, and gradually in the exhibition version, it runs for 10 minutes. And the figures, the little boxes change around so that they're never completely empty. They're always rotating until eventually at the end of 10 minutes, it goes back to white. This is a shorter version for artist talks, but you get the gist of what's going on. So this is quite often shown. You can see here how it was shown in the Gallery of Modern Art exhibition, which is called Deep in the Heart of Your Brain is a Lever. So this was shown on a plinth here, but it has also been shown on top of these ramp sculptures. So the one here was made for my exhibition Keep Up at Leamington Spa Art Gallery in 2014. And then I showed it again in this exhibition at the Gallery of Modern Arts in Glasgow, and it's now gone into their collection, along with a copy of the pose work film. So the film, the two works, I think, are very similar, but there are different ways of looking at how you deal with a condition, with how you deal with care. I think particularly the Deep in the Heart of Your Brain sculpture in the foreground is a work that is about caring and being a carer. And I think when I did a talk in the gallery when the show was on, and I remember having a really brilliant conversation with a man who'd just come through cancer treatment. And he was talking about how the dark spaces of that sculpture really spoke to him about the times where he'd felt very low when he was having his treatment. And also for me, these ramps are very important in these works because they're very heavy. And they're hard to lift, and they could hurt you if they slam down. And I always feel they're very much about that job of a carer, that you have to really go deep sometimes to find the strength to get you through to your next stage. And it's called Deep in the Heart of Your Brain is a Lever. Deep in the Heart of Your Brain is a Lever from a Patti Smith lyric. And I was very taken with a talk I heard Patti Smith give, which she came to Glasgow when my kids were really young, and I was really caring a lot for the kids. And she talked about a time in she was given poetry readings in the Burns room of the Mitchell Library, and it's quite an incredible night. And she talked about a time in her life when her husband died very suddenly, and her brother, and her children were very young at that point, and she was kind of living in a sort of rural, like Idaho or somewhere. And I was just I was really taken with her talking about this time in her life when her children were young. And I was amazed that she had gone through an experience that at that point I was also going through. So maybe a bit of that weight of responsibility was also in that work. But the levers are really important. These kind of ramps it's important to me that they move, that you can lift them. I got a hard time from Tom Shakespeare, who's an academic and who uses a wheelchair, and he was saying that the ramp, the gradient of that is really not correct enough. So I then had to make another one for another exhibition where the gradient was properly correct. It's a lot more sloped in other works that I've made since. I've made a few of these now. So as well as the ramp sculpture and the pose work film, the other series of work was more of these drawings that I had started again for the show with Leamington Spa, these drawings that I've titled Glimmer. And they're very, very tall. They're more formalized now, that they're not on such a long roll of paper so that they could be framed for the exhibition, but they're all 2 meters high. So they're very tall drawings. You can see them in the background here of the exhibition. And there's now about 12 of them out in the world, but there was 6 of them in this show. And I think there are always aspects of urban street architecture, maybe a street light, maybe a security camera. The one here's a security camera. This one is a street light. There's one of a mobile phone mast. They're all just pencil on paper with some carbon paper that I used to kind of trace the shape onto to get the idea of the angles. I use carbon paper from photocopies. I don't blow them up, or I don't kind of project them or anything. I just use these sort of kind of quite old-fashioned techniques to blow something up to that scale. So, and another piece in that show that is also quite relevant to talk about is headphone music, boats and trains, which I always see in relation to the deep in the heart of your brain artwork, the sort of solid, rigid box, which is just shown to the left of this sculpture in this exhibition. And then this work that is made from the same materials, it's made from powder coated aluminium, but in this one, it's all kind of a bit more bashed up and very precariously balanced, looking like it could maybe collapse if it was kind of not, it could easily be knocked over. And so you can see the deep in the heart of your brain black sculpture in the foreground, and then the headphone music, boats and trains from this aluminium that had been taken off of some trailers that was another artwork. So it had been journeyed a long way before it got to that exhibition. But I really like the comparison of these two works, where one looks like it could just collapse at any minute and one is much more rigid. So, and this piece here is called Nice Style, again, another reference to Bruce MacLean. And it's a long drawing, I would say, of it's like a railing or a support or a lightning flash. It's made of powder coated aluminium and it's very much wedged into the space. So I like these pieces. I've done another one of these since in a show at the Fruitmarket, which is green. But the idea of this, it came quite a lot from my dad, who used to lean on the washing line, and he really needed a walking stick but didn't use it. So he would move around the house, kind of touching various, he took support from various bits of the house that just were, that was how he managed to get around. And I see my sister doing the same thing now. So this piece, Nice Style, was a kind of bit of a reference to how the washing line in our garden used to kind of yank right down when he leaned on it to get down a little step. So yeah, that's it. So this is headphone music, boats and trains again. And yeah, I think that might be the last slide. So yeah, so that is the, that series of works I feel really does kind of, they've kind of explored my relationship with my sister and with this genetic condition that affects her. And in making the artworks, I feel like I've learned a lot about it, but also I hope kind of shown the similarities that we still have. I've gone on to make a lot of other works that are to explore this idea of similarity and difference, what makes us the same, what separates us, what unites us. But I feel that those works particularly, they kind of show a development of a relationship and also the development of a condition that continues to develop. But I wrote a lot about pose work for sisters, and I think to end, I feel kind of in a way that art gave me the language to talk about the condition at a time when I felt it was very hard. It was quite easy to talk about it when my niece was young, but as she's got older and as my sister has deteriorated, I find it harder to talk about the specifics of the condition. So actually the artworks that I made at that point, it was quite an intense period when I was finishing my PhD and having to really examine why I was making them. And so I think that process of looking at other artworks and using the language of art to give me the vocabulary, I think, to talk about something that I found very hard, was what I took the most from. So through the drawings, through the making of the films, and through the discussion of this condition with other women, and having the opportunity to make those artworks was really how I articulated those experiences. So I hope some of that comes over when you see them. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to say thank you very much for listening. Thanks.